In November 1966, people in Maryland started seeing something. It had wings, it had red eyes, and it was always watching. Welcome to local legends. The sky above Point Pleasant, West Virginia, not Maryland, though the error would spread through retellings for decades, hung low and gray that November evening. The Ohio River churning cold beneath the Silver Bridge's suspension cables. The air tasted of coal smoke and rust, the way it always did in that stretch of the valley, where industry had carved itself into the landscape and left behind a particular kind of quiet, not peace. Just the hum of a region that had learned to live with what it had become. The streetlights along Main Street flickered on at dusk, casting shallow pools of yellow across pavement, still damp from afternoon rain. Beyond the commercial strip, where Route 62 curved north toward the TNT area, 2,500 acres of abandoned World War II munitions, bunkers half, swallowed by scrub pine and kudzu. The darkness was total. No sodium lamps, no porch lights, just the kind of black that made distance impossible to judge, where a stand of trees 20 yards away could just as easily be a wall, or a figure, or nothing at all. On the night of the 15th of November, 1966, two young couples drove into that darkness and came back changed. Not in the way that makes for easy metaphor. This wasn't about loss of innocence, or they came back with a story that would metastasize across 13 months, spreading through Appalachian river towns and onto the front page of the Athens Messenger, the Charleston Gazette, the AP Wire. A story about something with wings. Something with eyes that burned red in the headlight beams. Something that shouldn't exist but did, and worse, seemed to follow them. The creature would be given a name borrowed from a Batman villain. Mothman, absurd and indelible in equal measure. And that name would outlive the people who saw it, outlive the bridge that fell, outlive the small industrial town that tried to forget. But before the name, before the headlines, before John Keel arrived with his notebook and his theories about ultra-terrestrials, there was only the sighting itself, and the sightings that followed, and the dread that settled over the Ohio Valley like a weather system that wouldn't break. A feeling that something was wrong in a way that couldn't be fixed by switching on more lights, or driving faster, or refusing to look up. The Mothman wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster in the fairy tale sense. It was a presence, a witness, an omen that arrived in the fall of 1966 and stayed just long enough to watch everything collapse. Point Pleasant sits at the confluence of the Ohio and Kanawha rivers, a geography that has always made it a crossing point for rivers, for roads, for the kind of history that leaves marks. The land belonged first to the Shawnee, then to Virginia, then to the new state of West Virginia. The Civil War split the region along Unionist lines. By the mid-20th century, it was a town of roughly 5,000 people, its economy tethered to chemical plants, power generation, and the Silver Bridge, a gleaming eye-bar, chain suspension span completed in 1928 that carried us Route 35 across the Ohio. The bridge was named for its aluminum paint, which gave the structure a silvery sheen in sunlight. In 1966, it was 38 years old, and showing its age in ways the State Highway Department had noted, but not yet addressed. The TNT area, formerly known as the West Virginia Ordnance Works, had been built in 1942 to manufacture explosives for the war effort. At its peak, the facility employed thousands of workers who mixed TNT, DNT, and other compounds in a grid of concrete igloos, designed to contain accidental detonations. After the war, the site was decommissioned, its buildings stripped and abandoned, its grounds left to rewild. By the 1960s, it was a local curiosity, a place teenagers drove to at night on dares, where the bunkers loomed like burial mounds, and the silence felt too large. There were rumors of contamination, of chemicals leaching into the groundwater, though no one used the word Superfund yet. That designation wouldn't come until decades later, after the sightings had ended and the explanations had begun. The Mothman entered this landscape, not as myth, but as encounter. The 12th of November, 1966. 5 men digging a grave in a cemetery near Clendenin, West Virginia, about 40 miles upriver from Point Pleasant, reported seeing a large winged figure rise from the trees, and pass overhead. They described it as human-shaped but larger, with a wingspan they estimated at 10 feet. 3 days later, on the 15th of November, two married couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry, Steve and Mary Millette, were driving near the TNT area around 11:30 at night when they saw what they later described to Deputy Millard Halstead of the Mason County Sheriff's Department as a creature standing upright near the gate of an abandoned power plant. It was gray, they said. It was tall, 6 or 7 feet. It had wings folded against its back, and when their headlights caught it, its eyes reflected red. The way an animal's eyes will glow in the dark, but larger, more intense, hypnotic. The creature took flight and followed their car as they sped away, reaching speeds of over 100 miles per hour on Route 62. They said it kept pace without flapping its wings, gliding alongside them until they reached the city limits of Point Pleasant, where it veered off toward the river. The couples went directly to the sheriff's office. Deputy Halstead took their report seriously enough to drive out to the TNT area with them. That same night, he found nothing. But he noted that all 4 witnesses were visibly shaken, pale, and coherent. There was no smell of alcohol, no signs of a prank, just terror. The Point Pleasant Register ran the story on the 16th of November. The headline read, "Couples see man-sized bird creature, something." The Associated Press picked it up the following day, and the name, Mothman, appeared almost immediately, coined by an Ohio newspaper copy editor who thought it sounded better than the bird. The sightings accelerated. Between November 1966 and December 1967, more than 100 people in the Point Pleasant area reported encounters with a large, winged creature matching the original description. The reports came from factory workers, housewives, police officers, construction crews, people with no particular interest in the paranormal and no obvious reason to fabricate. The creature was seen near the TNT area, along the riverfront, in residential neighborhoods, and on isolated stretches of Route 7. It was seen perched on rooftops, standing in fields, flying low over the Ohio River. Some witnesses reported a high-pitched screech. Others described a whirring sound, like machinery or enormous wings beating too fast to see. Almost all mentioned the eyes, red, luminous, unblinking. Several people reported feeling watched for days or weeks after an encounter, a sensation of being tracked by something just out of sight. On the 16th of November 1966, the day after the Scarberrys and Mallettes filed their report, Marcella Bennett was visiting friends who lived in a house near the TNT area. She was carrying her infant daughter when she saw a figure rise from the ground near her parked car. She described it as gray and man-shaped, with wings and red eyes. It moved toward her. She dropped her car keys and ran for the house, pounding on the door until her friends let her inside. They watched from the window as the creature stood in the yard, its wings partially spread. Before it finally moved off, Bennett would suffer recurring nightmares for years. Her daughter, too young to remember, would later report an inexplicable fear of large birds. On the 24th of November, 4 people driving near the TNT area reported seeing the creature standing in the road. When they swerved to avoid it, the creature rose into the air and pursued them for several miles. On the 25th of November, Thomas Urey, a shoe salesman driving along Route 62 in broad daylight, saw a tall, gray figure standing in a field. As he slowed to look, the creature spread enormous wings and took off, flying directly toward his car. Urey accelerated, reaching speeds of 75 miles per hour. The creature kept pace, flying alongside his driver's side window for nearly a mile before veering away. Urey went immediately to the sheriff's office. He was, by all accounts, badly shaken. By early December, the national press had descended on Point Pleasant. Reporters from the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Pittsburgh Press, and the New York Times arrived to interview witnesses and tour the TNT area. The tone of the coverage ranged from bemused skepticism to genuine unease. The witnesses themselves were remarkably consistent. A large, gray, humanoid figure with wings and glowing red eyes. No one described it as an owl. No one said it was an eagle. The consensus was clear and unsettling. This was something else. In mid-December, a local woman named Connie Carpenter claimed the creature had appeared outside her bedroom window at night, peering in at her. She described the same features: wings, red eyes, a sense of intelligence behind the stare. She moved out of the area shortly afterward. Another witness, 18-year-old Sheila Kane, reported seeing the creature on 3 separate occasions in late 1966, including once while driving with friends near the TNT area. Each time, she said, it seemed to be watching them, tracking their movements with it. Not all encounters were purely visual. Several witnesses reported electronic disturbances, televisions cutting to static, radios emitting strange pulses, car engines stalling without explanation. A few people claimed to receive bizarre phone calls, voices that sounded mechanical, clicks and beeps in place of words, or simply breathing. These details would later attract the attention of writer John Keel, who arrived in Point Pleasant in late 1966 and stayed through much of 1967, documenting the sightings and investigating the wave of strangeness that seemed to accompany the Mothman's presence. Keel's 1975 book, The Mothman Prophecies, would blend verifiable reports with more speculative theories about interdimensional beings and prophecies of disaster. But in the winter of 1966, the phenomenon was still unfolding, and the disaster had not yet come. On the 15th of December, 1967, 13 months after the first widely reported sighting, the Silver Bridge collapsed during evening rush hour. The failure began in a single corroded eye-bar near the Ohio Tower. The chain reaction was instantaneous. The bridge's entire deck dropped into the icy Ohio River, taking with it 37 vehicles and 46 people. 31 bodies were recovered in the days following the collapse. 2 more were found in the spring when the river thawed. 13 were never recovered. The disaster was the deadliest bridge collapse in American history at the time, and it remains one of the deadliest ever recorded in the United States. The National Transportation Safety Board's investigation concluded that the cause was a stress fracture in eye-bar 330, exacerbated by corrosion and inadequate inspection protocols. There was no mystery, no sabotage, no paranormal explanation, just metal fatigue and the failure of oversight. But in Point Pleasant, in the weeks and months after the collapse, people remembered the Mothman. They remembered the sightings near the bridge. They remembered the sense of unease, the feeling that something was wrong, and they began to connect the two, the creature and the catastrophe, not as cause and effect necessarily. Few seriously argued that a winged humanoid had sabotaged the eye-bar, but as warning and event, omen and fulfillment. The logic was folkloric, not mechanical, rooted in the old human need to see patterns in chaos and meaning in tragedy. The Mothman had been watching. The Mothman had known, and then it disappeared. After the bridge fell, sightings in the Point Pleasant area dropped to near zero. The creature, whatever it was, had moved on. The question that haunted the survivors and the curious alike was not what the Mothman was. That would remain unanswered, a matter of speculation and theory. But what it meant, was it a harbinger, appearing to mark sites of impending disaster? Was it a psychic manifestation, a projection of collective anxiety onto the landscape? Was it a misidentified animal, an owl or crane transformed by fear and poor lighting into something monstrous? Or was it, as Keel and others would suggest, something outside the usual categories, an ultra-terrestrial, a visitor from a reality adjacent to our own, drawn to places where the membrane between worlds grows thin? The sightings were real. The terror was real. The bridge collapsed. The Mothman occupied the space where those realities intersected, a figure that belonged to folklore and eyewitness testimony in equal measure. To understand the Mothman not as a singular anomaly, but as part of a larger pattern, we must step back from Point Pleasant and look at the deeper structure of omen creatures in human storytelling. The idea that disaster announces itself through signs, through strange animals, celestial phenomena, or figures that appear at the threshold is not unique to Appalachia or to the mid-20th century. It is a universal motif, appearing in the mythology of cultures across continents and millennia. The banshee of Irish tradition wails before a death. The Japanese tsunami stones mark the high water line of ancient floods with inscriptions warning future generations not to build below this point. The black dog of English folklore appears on lonely roads before calamity. These are not explanations. They are acknowledgements. The world gives warning, if only we know how to read it. The Mothman fits this template. It arrives at the TNT area, a landscape already marked by human industry and abandonment, a site that bears the residue of wartime production and Cold War obsolescence. It appears to people driving at night, to couples on dark roads, to individuals alone in their homes, moments when the usual certainties of daylight and community fall away. It does not speak, it does not attack. Though it inspires profound fear, it watches. And then, after the bridge falls and 46 people die, it vanishes. The omen has delivered its message. The pattern is complete. But the Mothman is also distinctly modern. It does not emerge from centuries of oral tradition, passed down through generations in the same valley. It appears suddenly, documented in police reports and newspaper articles, photographed badly and described in clinical detail. It exists in the overlap between folklore and mass media, between ancient archetype and contemporary case study. It belongs to the age of the highway, the factory, the evening news. Its name, Mothman, is a pop culture coinage, borrowed from a comic book. This is not the Wild Hunt or the Nightmare. This is something that appeared in West Virginia in 1966, terrified dozens of credible witnesses, and then disappeared, leaving behind a legend that would outlive most of the people who saw it. In the years following the Silver Bridge collapse, Point Pleasant struggled with grief, rebuilding, and the strange fame the Mothman had brought. The town erected a new bridge, completed in 1969, and tried to move forward. If anything, it grew, fed by John Keel's book, by documentaries and paranormal investigators, by the simple fact that no explanation had ever fully satisfied. The skeptics pointed to sandhill cranes, tall, grey, with red markings around the eyes and a wingspan that can reach 7 feet. The ornithologists noted that 1966 had been a year of unusual migratory patterns in the Ohio Valley. The psychologists invoked mass hysteria, misidentification, the power of suggestion. All of these explanations had merit. None of them accounted for everything. The Mothman endured because it served a need. It gave shape to the anxiety of living in a place where industry was failing, where bridges could collapse, where the future felt uncertain. It gave a face, or at least a pair of glowing eyes, to the sense that something was wrong, that disaster was coming, that the comfortable assumptions of daily life were more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. And it did so in a form that was both terrifying and, in a strange way, comforting. Because if the Mothman was real, if it was a warning, then the collapse of the Silver Bridge was not random. It was foretold. And if one disaster could be foretold, then perhaps the next one could be avoided. Perhaps we could learn to read the signs. This is the logic of the omen. It doesn't prevent catastrophe. It contextualizes it, gives it meaning, transforms random tragedy into narrative. The Mothman didn't save anyone on the 15th of December 1967, but for the people of Point Pleasant, and for the thousands who have since become fascinated by the legend, it offers something almost as valuable: the possibility that the universe is not indifferent, that some forces, however inscrutable, are paying attention. The Mothman sightings of 1966 and 1967 did not occur in a vacuum. They emerged from a specific landscape, a specific community, and a specific moment in American history. A moment when the certainties of the post-war boom were beginning to crack, when the costs of industrialization were becoming visible, when the infrastructure of the mid-century was starting to show its age. The TNT area, with its crumbling bunkers and contaminated soil, was a physical manifestation of that decline. The Silver Bridge, with its corroded eye-bar and inadequate inspections, was another. The Mothman appeared at the intersection of these failures, a creature born from the anxiety of living in a place that had been used and then forgotten. But to see the Mothman purely as a product of economic decline or environmental contamination is to miss half the story, because the Mothman is also a creature of the night, of the liminal spaces between wilderness and civilization, of the roads that lead away from town and into the dark. It is a figure of the threshold, appearing at the boundary where the known world ends and the unknown begins. And thresholds in folklore are always dangerous. They are where transformations happen, where rules change, where the ordinary gives way to the extraordinary. The Mothman is a threshold creature, and Point Pleasant in 1966 was a threshold town, caught between industrial past and uncertain future. Between the river and the hills, between the light of Main Street and the darkness of the TNT area, the people who saw the Mothman were not, by and large, seeking out the supernatural. They were driving home from work, visiting friends, living their lives. The creature came to them, uninvited and inexplicable, and that is part of what made it so terrifying. It violated the unspoken contract of modern life, which promises that if you follow the rules, drive the speed limit, pay your taxes, keep the porch light on, you will be safe. The Mothman appeared to people who were following the rules, and it showed them that the rules didn't matter. The Muslim from the side of the road pursued them at 100 miles. The Mothman is not a demon or a god. It is not a creature of legend handed down through generations. It is a modern apparition, documented and dated, witnessed and described, and yet it behaves exactly like the omens of older folklore. It announces disaster. It inspires dread. It appears and then vanishes, leaving behind questions that resist answers. In that sense, the Mothman is both utterly contemporary and deeply ancient, a 21st century cryptid that operates according to the logic of Bronze Age prophecy. It is a reminder that some patterns persist, that some fears are too fundamental to outgrow, and that the line between folklore and lived experience is thinner than we like to believe. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, is not Point Pleasant. Maryland, the error, repeated in the opening script and countless retellings since, is itself a kind of folklore, a mutation in the legend's transmission. But the essence remains. Something appeared in the Ohio Valley in the fall of 1966. It had wings. It had red eyes. It was seen by dozens of credible witnesses over 13 months. And then the bridge fell, and it was gone. What remains is the story, and the question, was it watching us, or were we watching it? And if it was a warning, did we learn to read it, or did we just? The Mothman, as described by witnesses in Point Pleasant between November 1966 and December 1967, was not a bird, and not quite human. Though it shared features of both, the consistency across eyewitness accounts is striking. Given the usual variability in cryptid descriptions, most witnesses reported a creature between 6 and 7 feet tall when standing upright. Its body was humanoid in general shape, torso, arms, legs, but covered in grey or greyish-brown skin, or hide that some likened to the texture of a bat's wing. There were no visible feathers. The wings, when folded, were described as being pressed against the back or sides. When spread, they measured an estimated 10 to 15 feet from tip to tip. Multiple witnesses noted that the creature did not flap its wings continuously while flying. Instead, it glided or hovered, suggesting either an unconventional form of lift or, less supernaturally, a morphology optimized for soaring. The head was small relative to the body, almost neckless, sitting directly on broad shoulders. This detail, the absence of a pronounced neck, appeared in report after report and distinguished the Mothman from the more common misidentification candidate, the sandhill crane, which has a long serpentine neck. The head itself was described as rounded or slightly dome-shaped, with no visible nose, mouth or ears. All the witnesses agreed on one detail above all others: the eyes. They were large, set wide apart on the upper part of the head, or where the head met the shoulders, and they glowed a brilliant red or orange, red in the dark. The glow was not simply reflective, like the eyeshine of a raccoon or deer caught in headlights. It was luminous, self-emitting, intense. Some witnesses compared it to bicycle reflectors. Others said it was like staring into red brake lights. A few described the sensation of being unable to look away, as though the gaze itself exerted a kind of gravity. The Mothman made sound, though not consistently. Some encounters were marked by total silence, a detail several witnesses found more unnerving than any screech or roar. Other reports included a high-pitched squeak or a mechanical whirring, compared variously to a generator, a large insect, or the sound of a motor struggling to turn over. One witness, interviewed by John Keel in early 1967, described a low humming that seemed to resonate in his chest, a frequency felt as much as heard. The creature moved with surprising speed on the ground, though it appeared ungainly and top-heavy when standing still. In flight, it was another matter entirely. Fast, agile, capable of keeping pace with cars traveling at freeway speeds. There are no reports of the Mothman physically attacking anyone. It pursued vehicles, it approached witnesses, it stood in yards and on rooftops, but it did not strike or injure. Its menace was entirely in its presence, in the fact that it was there at all and that it seemed interested in the people who saw it. The sense of being watched, of being tracked, was nearly universal among witnesses. Several reported seeing the creature multiple times over the course of weeks or months, often in different locations as though it were following them specifically. This pattern, repeated sightings by the same individuals, is common in cryptid and UFO lore and complicates any single misidentification theory. If the Mothman was simply a sandhill crane, why would the same person encounter it again and again in different settings, behaving in similar ways? The witnesses themselves varied widely in background and temperament. Roger Scarberry was a factory worker. Linda Scarberry was a housewife and mother. Thomas Urey sold shoes. Connie Carpenter was a local resident with no history of paranormal claims. Deputy Millard Halstead, who interviewed multiple witnesses and investigated several sighting locations, took the reports seriously enough to file them, and returned to the TNT area repeatedly, often in the company of witnesses, to search for evidence. No physical evidence was ever found. No feathers, no tracks, no nests, or the creature left behind only testimony, and, in a few cases, a lingering sense of dread that some witnesses reported feeling for months afterward. Variant descriptions did exist, though they were relatively minor. A few witnesses described the creature's eyes as being located lower on the chest, rather than on the head. An anatomical detail that would be difficult to reconcile with a living organism, but that appears in some early newspaper illustrations. This may have been a misunderstanding born of the creature's hunched posture, or the way its head sat flush with its shoulders, giving the impression that the eyes were on the torso when viewed from certain angles. Other witnesses reported a slight variation in color, describing the creature as darker gray, almost black, or lighter, almost tan. These discrepancies are consistent with differences in lighting, distance, and the subjective nature of memory under stress. What remained constant was the overall form, large, humanoid, winged, with glowing red eyes. John Keel, in his interviews with witnesses and his own visits to the TNT area, noted several additional details that did not make it into the mainstream press coverage. Some witnesses reported feeling physically ill after an encounter, headaches, nausea, a burning sensation in the eyes. These symptoms are consistent with acute stress reactions, but Keel speculated that they might also indicate exposure to some form of radiation or electromagnetic energy. He documented cases of electrical disturbances following sightings, televisions that wouldn't turn off, radios that switched stations on their own, car batteries that drained overnight. These phenomena, if real, suggest that the Mothman's presence was accompanied by measurable physical effects, though the exact mechanism remains unknown. Keel also noted a peculiar pattern in the timing and location of sightings. Most occurred between dusk and midnight. Most were concentrated within a 5-mile radius of the TNT area, though several outlier reports came from locations along the Ohio River as far north as New Haven, West Virginia, and as far south as Huntington. The TNT area itself, a 2,500-acre expanse of abandoned bunkers, crumbling roads, and second-growth forest, became the de facto center of Mothman activity. Why this location? The area was isolated, rarely patrolled, and honeycombed with dark enclosed spaces, where a large creature could theoretically hide during the day. It was also contaminated, though the extent of that contamination would not be fully understood until the Environmental Protection Agency designated it a Superfund site in 1983. Some researchers have suggested that the creature was drawn to the site because of the contamination, or that the contamination itself somehow contributed to the sightings. Through hallucinogenic exposure, through mutation of local wildlife, or through more esoteric means. The sandhill crane hypothesis, proposed by skeptics almost from the start, is worth examining in detail because it is the most parsimonious explanation, and yet fails to account for several key aspects of the sightings. Sandhill cranes are large birds, standing roughly 4 feet tall, with a wingspan that can exceed 6 feet. They are grey, with a red patch of bare skin on the crown of the head. They are capable of soaring and gliding, and they occasionally winter in the Ohio Valley, though they are more commonly found further south. A crane seen at dusk or at night, backlit by headlights or illuminated by a flashlight, could plausibly be mistaken for something larger and more humanoid, especially if the witness is already in a heightened state of alertness or fear. But the problems with the crane hypothesis accumulate quickly. Sandhill cranes have long, thin legs and a long, snake-like neck, features that would be difficult to miss, even in poor lighting. They do not pursue vehicles at 100 miles per hour. They do not stand motionless on rooftops or peer through windows. They do not hover without flapping their wings, and they do not explain why the same witnesses saw the creature multiple times, in different locations, behaving in ways inconsistent with crane behavior. The crane hypothesis also requires that dozens of witnesses, including experienced hunters and outdoorsmen, familiar with local wildlife, all independently misidentified the same species in similar ways. This is not impossible, but it strains credulity. An alternative hypothesis involves owls, specifically the barn owl or the barred owl, both of which are native to West Virginia. Barn owls have pale, heart-shaped faces and dark eyes that can appear to glow red in certain lighting. They fly silently and are known to approach humans, particularly if they have been habituated to human presence through proximity to structures like barns or silos. But barn owls are at most 1.5 feet tall. To mistake one for a 6 or 7 foot humanoid requires not just poor lighting, but a complete breakdown of spatial reasoning. The owl hypothesis is even less convincing than the crane hypothesis, and yet it persists, largely because it offers a naturalistic explanation that fits within the boundaries of conventional zoology. What both hypotheses fail to address is the behavior of the witnesses. These were not people looking for a monster. They were not out on a ghost hunt or a cryptid expedition. They were driving home from work, visiting friends, going about their lives in a small Appalachian town. When they saw the Mothman, their first instinct was not excitement or curiosity, but fear. They ran. They called the police. They moved out of the area. This is not the profile of hoaxers or attention seekers. These are people who saw something that violated their understanding of the world and were deeply shaken by the experience. The Mothman's abilities, as described by witnesses, also deserve scrutiny. It could fly, obviously, though the mechanics of its flight remain unclear. It could move at high speed, both on the ground and in the air. It appeared to be capable of tracking individuals, either through scent, sight, or some other sense. It was nocturnal, or at least most active at night. It did not appear to communicate, except through its presence and its gaze, and it seemed to possess a kind of awareness, an intentionality, that set it apart from ordinary animals. When it looked at you, witnesses said, it was looking at you, not through you, not past you, but directly at you, with a focus that felt personal. There were no known weaknesses, no reports of the creature. It left when it chose to leave, and it appeared when it chose to appear. This invulnerability, this autonomy, is a hallmark of folkloric entities. The Mothman was not a creature that could be captured or killed. It was a presence that had to be endured, a witness that could not be dismissed. And for 13 months, the people of Point Pleasant endured it, reporting sightings to the police, to the press, to anyone who would listen, until the bridge fell and the sightings stopped, and the question shifted from what is it to what did it mean. The Mothman does not fit neatly into any established category. It is not quite a cryptid, because cryptids are typically theorized as flesh and blood animals that science has not yet catalogued. Bigfoot, the thylacine, the ivory-billed woodpecker, the Mothman with its glowing eyes and apparent lack of physical needs. It was never seen eating, drinking, or nesting, seems less biological and more spectral. It is not quite a ghost, because ghosts are remnants, echoes of the dead. The Mothman was active, purposeful, present. It is not quite a demon, because demons operate within a religious framework, and the Mothman made no demands, offered no bargains, spoke no words. It simply was. And then it wasn't. It appeared before disaster. It watched. It left. And in that sense, it belongs to a long tradition of harbingers, creatures that mark the threshold between the ordinary world and the catastrophic, between the known and the unthinkable. The red eyes were not just a physical trait, they were a symbol, a warning light, a signal that something was wrong and that time was running out. The people who saw the Mothman could not have known that the bridge would collapse. But afterward, when they looked back, the pattern seemed obvious. The warning had been there all along, they just hadn't known how to read it. The Mothman, as an entity, does not emerge from a single clear origin myth in the way that creatures like the Wendigo or the Yeti do. There is no Mothman creation story passed down through generations of Appalachian families. There is no ritual that summons it, no taboo whose violation triggers its appearance. The Mothman simply arrived in November 1966, fully formed, and began haunting the Ohio Valley. This absence of deep cultural backstory is itself significant. It marks the Mothman as a modern phenomenon, a creature born not from oral tradition but from lived experience and media documentation. And yet, the logic of its appearance, the pattern of omen and disaster, is as old as storytelling itself. In the absence of a traditional origin myth, we must look at what the Mothman does rather than what it is. It appears before catastrophe, it watches, it does not intervene, it does not explain itself. This is the behavior of an omen, a herald, a psychopomp in the making. In Greek mythology, the psychopomp is the guide of souls, the figure that appears at the moment of death to lead the departed into the afterlife. Hermes, Charon, the Valkyries, the Mothman, in the 13 months before the Silver Bridge collapse, was performing a similar function, though not for individuals but for a community. It was marking Point Pleasant as a place on the edge, a town about to cross a threshold into tragedy. The absence of transformation narrative, the lack of any story explaining how a human becomes a Mothman, is worth examining. In many folkloric traditions, monsters are not born but made. The vampire is created through a bite. The werewolf is cursed. The Wendigo is a human who has consumed human flesh and been twisted by the act into a cannibalistic spirit. These transformations serve a moral function. They are punishments for transgression, warnings against taboo. The Mothman, by contrast, has no such backstory. It is not a person who has been changed. It is simply other, a being that exists outside the human community and operates according to its own inscrutable rules. This distinction is crucial. The Mothman is not a cautionary tale about individual behavior. It is not a warning against greed or cruelty or hubris. It is a warning about place, about systems, about the infrastructure of modern life. It appeared at the TNT area, a site marked by industrial contamination and abandonment. It appeared before the collapse of the Silver Bridge, a structure compromised by decades of inadequate maintenance. The message, if we can call it that, is not moral but structural. Pay attention to what you've built, because it will not last forever. And when it fails, people will die. In folklore, there are beings that serve as boundary markers, entities associated with specific geographic features or thresholds. The Japanese have the kami of mountains and rivers, spirits tied to particular places that must be honored and appeased. The Greeks had nymphs and dryads, localized divinities that embodied the life of a spring or a grove. The Mothman in this sense might be understood as a genius loci, a spirit of place, specific to Point Pleasant and the Ohio Valley in the mid-1960s. It emerged from the landscape, from the abandoned bunkers and the aging bridge, from the particular convergence of geography, industry, and decline that defined that moment in that town. But if the Mothman is a genius loci, it is a dark one. It does not protect the place it inhabits. It does not nurture or sustain. It simply bears witness. This is closer to the role of the banshee in Irish tradition, a spirit that wails before a death in certain families. The banshee does not cause the death, it announces it. The family hears the wail, the knowledge brings no comfort, only dread. The Mothman, seen night after night in the fall and winter of 1966, served the same function. It told the people of Point Pleasant that something was coming, but it did not tell them what or when or how to stop it. The question of agency is also important. Did the Mothman appear because it knew the bridge would collapse? Or did the bridge collapse because the Mothman appeared? This is the difference between prophecy and causation, between warning and curse. The former interpretation, that the Mothman was simply observing an inevitable event, is the more parsimonious and aligns with the omen tradition. Omens do not make things happen, they mark them. The comet that appears before a king's death does not kill the king. It signals that the king's time has come. The Mothman, in this reading, was a signal. The bridge was already failing. The corrosion in I-bar 330 had been progressing for years. The collapse was written into the structure's aging metal long before the first sighting. The Mothman simply saw what was coming and marked it with its presence. The alternative interpretation, that the Mothman's appearance somehow contributed to the collapse, either through direct action or through some kind of metaphysical influence, requires a causal mechanism that no witness or investigator has ever identified. The creature did not sabotage the bridge. It did not weaken the I-bar. It did not cause the cars to line up on the deck at the moment of failure. To argue for causation is to argue for a level of supernatural intervention that goes beyond the omen archetype and into the realm of the curse. The hex, the deliberate infliction of harm, and there is no evidence, testimonial or physical, that the Mothman intended harm. It watched, that is all. The absence of protection is also telling. In many folkloric traditions, there are rituals or objects that can ward off malevolent entities. Iron against the fae, salt against spirits, Christian prayer against demons. But no one in Point Pleasant reported that anything worked against the Mothman. It appeared when and where it chose, and it left on its own terms. There were no exorcisms, no protective charms. This suggests either that the Mothman was not malevolent in the traditional sense, and therefore not something that needed to be warded off, or that it operated according to rules so foreign to human understanding, that our protective rituals had no purchase on it. One final aspect of the Mothman's nature, as described by witnesses, is its silence. It did not speak. It did not cry out in any recognizable language. It made sounds, the squeaks, they were simply noise, byproducts of movement or flight or presence. This silence is powerful. It renders the Mothman inscrutable, impossible to negotiate with, immune to pleading or prayer. If it had spoken, it would have been something we could relate to, something we could reason with, or at least understand. Its silence makes it absolute, alien, a presence from outside the human sphere of meaning. The Mothman, then, is best understood not as a creature with a backstory, but as a phenomenon with a function. It appears at sites of impending disaster. It watches those who will be affected. It offers no explanation and no escape. And then, when the disaster occurs, it leaves. This is not transformation, this is visitation. The people of Point Pleasant did not become Mothmen, they were visited by one. The Mothman did not belong to their world, but for 13 months, it occupied a space within it. A space defined by the TNT area's darkness and the bridge's inevitable failure. When that space closed, when the bridge fell and the dead were counted, the Mothman had no further reason to stay. Its work, whatever that work was done. The Mothman entered the broader American consciousness, not through indigenous tradition or centuries, old folklore, but through the machinery of 20th century media and investigation. The first outsider to take the Point Pleasant sightings seriously as a phenomenon worthy of sustained attention was John Alva Keel, a journalist and paranormal investigator who had spent much of the 1960s writing about UFOs, poltergeists, and other anomalies. Keel arrived in Point Pleasant in late November 1966, less than 2 weeks after the first widely publicized sightings, and remained involved with the case through 1967 and beyond, conducting hundreds of interviews and compiling a massive archive of witness testimony, newspaper clippings, and personal observations. Keel's approach was not that of a skeptic attempting to debunk the sightings, nor was it that of a credulous believer accepting every claim at face value. He took the witnesses seriously, while also recognizing the broader pattern of strangeness that seemed to accompany the Mothman reports. UFO sightings in the same region, bizarre phone calls, premonitions, and a general atmosphere of dread. Keel's working theory, developed over months of investigation, was that the Mothman was not a biological creature, but a manifestation of what he called ultra-terrestrials, entities from a dimension or reality parallel to our own, capable of crossing over under certain conditions. This theory, detailed in his 1975 book The Mothman Prophecies, was speculative and resistant to conventional proof. But it had the advantage of accounting for the creature's behavior in ways that zoology could not. Keel's interviews with witnesses revealed details that had not appeared in the initial press coverage. Several people reported receiving strange phone calls in the weeks and months following their sightings. Calls in which the voice on the other end sounded mechanical, or spoke in a monotone, or asked bizarre questions about the witness's health, activities, and beliefs. A few people reported visits from men in dark suits who claimed to be from the government or from unspecified organizations, and who asked detailed questions about what the witnesses had seen. These so-called men in black reports were common in UFO lore, but unusual in cryptid cases, and they added a layer of paranoia to an already unsettling phenomenon. Were these actual government agents investigating the sightings for reasons unknown, or were they, as Keel speculated, part of the same ultra-terrestrial phenomenon that had produced the Mothman itself? Keel also documented a pattern of precognition among some witnesses. A woman named Mary Heyer, a reporter for the Point Pleasant Register who had covered the Mothman sightings extensively, told Keel that she had experienced vivid nightmares in the weeks before the Silver Bridge collapse. Dreams of water, of falling, of people screaming. Another witness reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread on the afternoon of the 15th of December, 1967. Hours before the bridge fell. These premonitions, if genuine, suggested that the Mothman's presence was accompanied by a kind of temporal disturbance, a ripple in the normal flow of cause and effect that allowed some sensitive individuals to perceive the coming disaster before it occurred. Keel took these reports seriously, though he acknowledged that premonitions are notoriously difficult to verify and subject to hindsight bias. The Mothman Prophecies, published 8 years after the bridge collapse, was not a conventional cryptozoology book. It blended witness interviews, personal anecdotes, and speculative theory into a narrative that was part investigation, part memoir, and part metaphysical treatise. Keel argued that the Mothman was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a larger pattern of phenomena: UFOs, ghosts, poltergeists, men in black, that all pointed to the existence of non-human intelligences interacting with humanity in ways we do not fully understand. He suggested that these entities fed on human fear, that they manipulated reality in subtle ways, and that they appeared at moments of historical or personal crisis. The Silver Bridge collapse, in this framework, was not simply a tragedy, but a focal point. A moment when the boundary between the normal and the paranormal became dangerously thin. Keel's theories were met with skepticism by mainstream scientists and journalists, but they resonated with a particular segment of the American reading public, people who had experienced their own anomalous events, who felt that the official explanations for things like UFO sightings and cryptid encounters were inadequate, and who were willing to entertain the possibility that the universe was stranger and more dangerous than conventional wisdom allowed. The Mothman Prophecies became a cult classic, reprinted multiple times, and eventually adapted into a 2002 film starring Richard Gere. Keel's interpretation of the Mothman, as harbinger, as ultra-terrestrial, as something far more complex than a misidentified bird, became the dominant lens through which the legend was understood, particularly outside of Point Pleasant itself. But Keel was not the only outsider to investigate the sightings. In the months following the first reports, the area attracted a steady stream of journalists, cryptozoologists, and curiosity seekers. The coverage in national media ranged from earnest to sensational. The New York Times ran a brief, straightforward account on the 18th of November 1966, treating the sightings as a local curiosity. Other outlets, particularly tabloid newspapers and men's adventure magazines, ran more lurid stories with titles like "The Monster That Terrorized West Virginia" and "Winged Demon Stalks Rivertown." These articles often embellished the witness accounts, adding details that did not appear in the original police reports and transforming the Mothman from a strange but largely passive presence into an active menace. The effect of this media coverage was double-edged. On one hand, it brought the Mothman to national attention, ensuring that the legend would outlast the sightings themselves. On the other hand, It introduced distortions and exaggerations that would become inseparable from the core story. Later retellings would claim that the Mothman had attacked people, that it had caused car accidents, that it had been seen tearing apart livestock, none of which appeared in the original 1966 to 1967 witness statements. The legend, like all legends, began to evolve as it passed through the filter of mass media, shaped by the demands of narrative drama and the expectations of an audience that wanted the Mothman to be not just strange but terrifying. Scientific investigators were slower to arrive, and when they did, their conclusions were dismissive. Ornithologists pointed to the sandhill crane hypothesis. Psychologists suggested mass hysteria or shared delusion, arguing that the initial sightings by the Scarberries and Mallets had planted a suggestion that subsequent witnesses then projected onto ordinary animals or shadows. Sociologists noted that Point Pleasant was a small, economically depressed town in a region marked by decline, and suggested that the Mothman was a psychological manifestation of collective anxiety, a way for the community to externalize its fears about the future. All of these explanations had a kernel of plausibility, and all of them failed to account for the sheer consistency and specificity of the witness testimony. The bridge collapse itself was investigated thoroughly, but not in connection with the Mothman. The National Transportation Safety Board's report, completed in 1968, attributed the failure to a stress fracture in I-bar 330 of the bridge's suspension chain. The fracture had been caused by a combination of corrosion and repeated loading over nearly 4 decades. The report made no mention of strange creatures or omens. It was a straightforward engineering failure, the kind that happens when infrastructure is not properly maintained. And yet, for the people of Point Pleasant, the two events, the sightings and the collapse, were impossible to separate. The Mothman had been there, the bridge had fallen. The connection, in their minds, was undeniable. The decades since, the Mothman has been reinterpreted by successive waves of researchers. Cryptozoologists have continued to search for a biological explanation, proposing increasingly exotic candidates. An unknown species of owl, a mutant crane, a surviving pterosaur. UFO researchers have linked the Mothman to the wave of UFO sightings that swept the Ohio Valley in the same period, suggesting that the creature was either an extraterrestrial entity or a manifestation of the same forces that produce UFO encounters. Paranormal investigators have framed the Mothman as a ghost, a demon or a tulpa, a thought, form created by collective belief. Each interpretation tells us as much about the interpreter as it does about the Mothman itself. What all of these outsider interpretations share is an attempt to domesticate the legend, to fit it into a pre-existing category that makes it comprehensible. The skeptics want it to be a crane. The cryptozoologists want it to be an undiscovered animal. The paranormal researchers want it to be a ghost. John Keel wanted it to be an ultra-terrestrial. But the Mothman, as experienced by the witnesses in 1966 and 1967, resists these neat categorizations. It was not quite a bird, not quite a ghost, not quite a demon. It was, in the most literal sense, anomalous. Something that didn't fit. Something that violated the expected patterns of reality. And that may be the most honest thing we can say about it. It appeared, it was witnessed, and it left behind a question that has not yet been answered. The gap between the witnesses' for the people who saw the Mothman, the creature was not a puzzle to be solved. It was a reality to be survived. They did not care whether it was a crane or an ultra-terrestrial. They cared that it was watching them, that it filled them with dread, and that after the bridge fell and their friends and neighbors died, it went away. The meaning they assigned to the Mothman was not scientific or theoretical. It was personal and communal, a warning they had received and failed to heed, or perhaps a warning that could not be heeded, because the disaster was already written into the corroded steel of I-bar 330. The outsider lens, for all its rigor and curiosity, often misses this emotional truth. The Mothman mattered not because of what it was, but because of what it witnessed. It was there at the threshold, at the edge of catastrophe, and it looked the people of Point Pleasant in the eye. And then the catastrophe came, and the creature was gone, and the people were left to carry on with the weight of that knowledge, that something had known, something had been watching, and it had not saved them. On the evening of the 15th of December, 1967, the Silver Bridge was carrying rush, hour traffic between Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and Gallipolis, Ohio. It was a Friday. Christmas was 10 days away. The temperature hovered in the low 40s Fahrenheit, and a light rain had fallen earlier in the day, leaving the roadway damp but not icy. At approximately 5 p.m., the bridge was crowded with vehicles, 37 cars and trucks in total, carrying 64 people. Others were Christmas shopping. A few were simply passing through, travelers for whom Point Pleasant was a waypoint on a longer journey. The collapse, when it came, was instantaneous. I-bar 330, a critical component in the bridge's suspension system, fractured. The fracture propagated through the chain in a matter of seconds, and the entire 1,760-foot span dropped into the Ohio River. Witnesses on both shores described a sound like a crack or a gunshot, followed by a roar as the deck twisted and fell. Cars tumbled into the water or were crushed beneath falling steel. The river was cold, 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and moving swiftly. Those who survived the initial impact had only minutes before hypothermia set in. Rescue efforts began immediately, but the conditions were brutal. It was nearly dark. The river was cluttered with debris, chunks of concrete, twisted metal, sections of roadway. Boats put out from both sides, their crews searching for survivors in the water. Divers were dispatched, but visibility was near zero, and the current made the work slow and dangerous. By the end of the night, 9 people had been pulled from the water alive. 31 bodies were recovered in the following days. 2 more were found in the spring thaw. 13 were never recovered, their remains lost somewhere in the river or buried beneath the wreckage. The dead included office workers, truck drivers, housewives, children. One of the victims was a pregnant woman. Another was a 3-year-old boy. The youngest victim overall was 3 months old. The disaster cut across the community without regard for age, gender, or station. It was random in the way that structural failures are random, a matter of who happened to be on the bridge at the moment the I-bar gave way. But for the people of Point Pleasant, it did not feel random. It felt like the culmination of something that had been building since November 1966, when the Mothman first appeared. The connection was not made immediately. In the hours and days after, they remembered the sightings near the bridge. They remembered the sense of dread that had hung over the town for 13 months. They remembered the creature with the red eyes that had watched them from the darkness, and they began to talk, quietly at first, and then more openly, about the possibility that the Mothman had been a warning, that it had appeared not to cause the disaster, but to announce it, to mark Point Pleasant as a place on the edge of catastrophe. This interpretation was not universal. Many residents rejected it, either because they had never seen the Mothman themselves, or because they found the idea too unsettling to accept. The official investigation, conducted by the National Transportation Safety Board and released in 1971, made no mention of the sightings. The report concluded that the collapse was caused by a stress fracture in I-bar 330, exacerbated by corrosion and the bridge's age. The fracture had likely been present for years, growing slowly with each cycle of loading and unloading, until it reached a critical size, and the I-bar gave way under the weight of rush. Or traffic, it was a mechanical failure, explicable and preventable. If the bridge had been inspected more rigorously, if the corrosion had been detected and the I-bar replaced, the disaster would not have occurred. And yet, the question persisted. Why had the Mothman appeared, if it was simply a misidentified animal? Why had sightings clustered in the 13 months before the collapse, and then ceased almost entirely afterward? If it was a hoax or mass hysteria, why had so many credible witnesses, people with no history of paranormal claims, and no obvious motive to fabricate, reported the same creature in similar terms? And why had several witnesses seen the creature near the bridge itself, standing on the banks of the Ohio, or perched on the superstructure, as though it were keeping vigil? Jorn Keel, in the Mothman Prophecies, argued that the bridge collapse was the event the Mothman had been heralding all along. He noted that several witnesses had experienced premonitions in the days before the disaster, dreams of falling, of water, of death, and that the atmosphere in Point Pleasant in late 1967 had been charged with a sense of impending doom. Keel suggested that the Mothman was a manifestation of a force or intelligence that existed outside of normal time, capable of perceiving future events and announcing them through its presence. The creature did not cause the collapse, in Keel's view, but it marked the town as a place where tragedy was about to unfold. This interpretation resonated with many in Point Pleasant, particularly those who had lost loved ones in the disaster. It offered a narrative framework in which the collapse was not simply random but foreshadowed, not just a mechanical failure but a cosmic event marked by signs and portents. It transformed the Mothman from a local oddity into a figure of mythic significance, a harbinger that bridged the gap between the mundane and the numinous. And it gave the victims a kind of meaning, or at least a context. They had not died for nothing, but as part of a pattern, as witnesses to a larger mystery. But the connection between the Mothman and the bridge collapse is not supported by any physical evidence. The creature did not tamper with the eye-bar. It did not weaken the steel or corrode the metal. The collapse was, by all measurable accounts, an engineering failure, the result of decades of deferred maintenance and inadequate inspection protocols. The Mothman, if it existed at all, was a bystander, not a cause. The question, then, is not whether the Mothman caused the disaster, but whether it knew the disaster was coming. And if it knew, what does that mean? In folklore, omens do not prevent disaster. They announce it. The comet appears, and the kingdom falls. The omen does not change the course of events. It marks them, gives them weight, transforms them from accidents into inevitabilities. The Mothman, in this reading, was an omen in the oldest sense. A sign that the bridge was going to fall, that 46 people were going to die, and that the town of Point Pleasant was about to be torn apart by grief. But omens in the modern world are supposed to be metaphorical. We do not believe that comets cause the deaths of kings. We understand that the comet and the death are separate events, linked only by timing and human psychology. We have learned to see omens as projections of our own anxiety, not as real presences in the world. And yet, the Mothman was witnessed. It was described in consistent detail by dozens of people. It behaved in ways that suggested intentionality, awareness, purpose. It was not a metaphor, it was there. The collapse of the Silver Bridge killed 46 people and ended the Mothman's sightings. The two events are inseparable in the legend, linked not by causation but by proximity, by the fact that one followed the other and that the people who survived both could not help but see a pattern. The bridge fell because of corrosion and stress and time. The Mothman appeared because we do not know. It appeared, and then the bridge fell, and then it left. The sequence is factual. The meaning is elusive. In the years following the disaster, Point Pleasant rebuilt. A new bridge was completed in 1969, a modern structure with redundant safety systems and rigorous inspection protocols. The town held memorial services for the victims, erected plaques, and tried to move on. But the Mothman did not go away. It lingered in memory, in conversation, in the stories people told about the year the creature came and the bridge fell. It became part of the town's identity, a dark jewel in the crown of its history. And slowly, over decades, the Mothman transformed from a source of fear into a source of fascination, from a harbinger of disaster into a tourist attraction. Point Pleasant now hosts an annual Mothman festival, drawing thousands of visitors each September. The town has erected a 12-foot, tall chrome statue of the creature in the center of downtown, complete with glowing red eyes and spread wings. There is a Mothman museum, filled with newspaper clippings, witness interviews, and replicas of the creature, based on various descriptions. The town has, in effect, reclaimed the legend, turned it into something that can be celebrated rather than feared. This transformation is a kind of healing, a way of taking control of a narrative that once felt overwhelming and tragic, but it also represents a shift in meaning. The Mothman is no longer an omen, it is an icon, a brand, a piece of folklore that has been sanitized for public consumption. The witnesses themselves, those still living, have mixed feelings about this transformation. Some embrace it, glad that their experiences are finally taken seriously. Others are uncomfortable with the commercialization, feeling that the fear and grief of 1966 to 1967 have been flattened into something cute, something that can be printed on a t-shirt or molded into a plastic figurine. The Mothman for them was not a mascot. It was a presence that changed their lives, that marked them as witnesses to something inexplicable. And the bridge collapse was not a story to be retold at festivals. It was a tragedy that took their friends, their neighbors, their family members. This tension, it has become a myth, a story that belongs to everyone and no one, that can be adapted and reinterpreted and sold. The meaning has shifted from the personal to the collective, from the particular to the universal. And in that shift, something has been lost. The rawness, the fear, the sense that something genuinely strange had occurred, and that the world was not as orderly as we had believed. The documented cases of Mothman sightings extend beyond Point Pleasant, though the Ohio Valley remains the epicenter of the phenomenon. In the years and decades following 1967, reports of similar creatures have surfaced in other locations, often in the lead up to disasters or tragedies. In September 1978, witnesses in Freiburg, Germany, reported seeing a large winged humanoid in the weeks before a mine collapse that killed several workers. In December 1986, residents near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine reported sightings of a creature they called the Blackbird of Chernobyl. In the days before the reactor explosion, these reports are less well documented than the Point Pleasant sightings, and they are more easily dismissed as folklore inspired by the Mothman legend itself, a kind of cultural contagion. But they suggest that the archetype of the winged harbinger is not limited to one town or one disaster. It is a pattern that recurs, a figure that appears when the boundary between the ordinary and the catastrophic grows thin. In November 2001, several witnesses in New York City reported seeing a large winged figure near the World Trade Center in the days before the 11th of September attacks. These reports did not gain widespread attention until after the attacks, and they are difficult to verify. But they follow the pattern. A creature appears. A disaster follows. The creature is gone. The omen has delivered its message, and the message, as always, is the same. Something is wrong. Something is coming, and you cannot stop it. The Mothman is not unique in pop culture, but its specific form, the winged humanoid with glowing red eyes, has been replicated and referenced enough times to constitute a minor cultural phenomenon. The creature made its first major appearance outside the confines of Point Pleasant in the 1970s, as the counterculture movement's interest in the paranormal and the unexplained reached its peak. The Mothman Prophecies, published in 1975, was reviewed in 14 times. The British magazine dedicated to anomalous phenomena and serialized in several underground newspapers. It found an audience among readers who were already primed to believe in UFOs, Bigfoot, and government conspiracies. The Mothman, with its mix of eyewitness testimony and metaphysical speculation, fit neatly into this milieu. The creature's first significant pop culture reference came in 1993, when The X-Files, the Fox television series about FBI agents investigating paranormal cases, aired an episode titled Dwayne Barry, that featured a brief mention of a winged humanoid sighting in West Virginia. The reference was oblique, a throwaway line in a larger story, but it introduced the Mothman to a generation of viewers who might not have read Keel's book or heard the original news reports. The X-Files was, at the time, one of the most popular shows on television, and its validation of the Mothman, treating it as a legitimate part of the paranormal landscape, helped cement the legend's place in broader American folklore. In 1996, while Venomoth is not a direct reference to the Mothman, the name is close enough, and the design features, wings, large eyes, nocturnal habits, are suggestive. The Pokémon games and animated series became a global phenomenon, reaching tens of millions of children and young adults. For many of them, Venomoth was their first encounter with a moth-man concept, even if they had no idea it was connected to a cryptid sighting in West Virginia. The reference is subtle, perhaps coincidental, but it demonstrates how far the Mothman's image had traveled by the mid-1990s, filtering into youth culture through a Japanese game franchise, with no direct link to Appalachian folklore. The Mothman Prophecies was adapted into a feature film in 2002, directed by Mark Pellington and starring Richard Gere as a fictionalized version of John Keel. The film took significant liberties with the source material, transforming Keel's investigative narrative into a psychological thriller with strong horror elements. The Mothman itself appears only briefly, rendered as a shadowy winged figure glimpsed in mirrors, in photographs, in the corners of the frame. The film emphasizes the creature's role as an omen, focusing on the premonitions and nightmares that plagued witnesses before the Silver Bridge collapse. It is not a particularly faithful adaptation. Keel himself expressed reservations about the changes, but it succeeded in introducing the Mothman to a mainstream audience. The film grossed over $55 million worldwide and solidified the creature's place in the pantheon of American cryptids. Following the film's release, the Mothman experienced a surge in cultural visibility. It appeared in video games, including Silent Hill and Fallout 76, the latter set in West Virginia, and featuring the Mothman as a recurring enemy and ally. It was referenced in comic books, notably in a 2017 storyline in The Terrifics, a DC Comics series that reimagined the Mothman as a tragic figure. It became a staple of creepy countdown videos on YouTube, where it was presented alongside creatures like the Rake, the Wendigo, and Slender Man, a curated list of internet-age folklore and older cryptids blended into a single, undifferentiated catalogue of fear. The evolution of the Mothman in pop culture follows a familiar trajectory, from local legend to national curiosity to global icon. At each stage, the creature's meaning shifts. In Point Pleasant in 1966, the Mothman was a source of genuine terror, an anomaly that violated the expected order of reality. In John Keel's book, it became a symbol of the unknown, a representative of forces beyond human comprehension. It became shorthand for government cover-ups and conspiracies. In YouTube videos, it became content, something to be consumed and shared and forgotten. What was lost in this evolution was specificity. The Mothman, as originally described, was not a generic monster. It was a particular presence, tied to a particular place at a particular time. It appeared at the TNT area near the Silver Bridge, in the Ohio Valley in the 13 months before 46 people died. It was witnessed by people who had no reason to lie and every reason to wish they had never seen it. But as the legend spread, these particulars faded. The Mothman became a template, a figure that could be dropped into any story that needed a cryptid or a harbinger. It became, in the language of semiotics, a floating signifier, a symbol detached from its original referent, available to mean whatever the storyteller needed it to mean. This is not unusual. It is how folklore works in the modern age. Stories travel, mutate, adapt to new contexts. The vampire of Eastern European peasant tradition, a bloated, disease-spreading corpse, became the elegant aristocrat of Dracula. The werewolf of medieval Europe, a figure of sin and damnation, became the tragic victim of a curse. The Mothman, in turn, has become whatever the current cultural moment needs it to be. A horror villain, a mascot, a metaphor for surveillance, a symbol of environmental collapse, a tourist attraction. But the original witnesses, those still living, remember something different. They remember red eyes and wings and the feeling of being watched. They remember driving too fast on Route 62, fleeing something that should not have existed. They remember the bridge falling and the people dying and the creature disappearing, all within the span of 13 months. And they remember the question that has never been answered. Why? Why did it appear? Why did it watch? Why did it leave? Pop culture cannot answer these questions. It can only recycle them, turn them into narratives that fit the expectations of genre and audience. The Mothman of Point Pleasant, the one that Roger Scarborough and Linda Scarborough saw on the 15th of November 1966, has been replaced by 1,000 versions, each one a little less strange, a little less particular, a little less real. The legend has been democratized, made accessible, and in the process, it has been domesticated. The omen has become entertainment, and yet the core image persists, a figure with wings and red eyes, watching from the darkness. That image, stripped of context and explanation, remains powerful. It taps into something primal, something old. It is the image of the watcher in the dark, the presence that knows more than we do, The thing that stands at the threshold and marks the passage from the known to the unknown. That image cannot be fully domesticated, no matter how many t-shirts it appears, because at its core it is an image of our own vulnerability, of the fact that we do not control the world as much as we think we do. And that disaster can come without warning, or with a warning we do not know how to read. The Mothman, in its transformation from local terror to global icon, carries with it a lesson about the nature of belief and the function of monsters. We create monsters to explain what we cannot understand, to give shape to our fears, to mark the boundaries of the safe and the known. But sometimes, the monsters create themselves. They appear, unbidden, at the edges of our world, and they force us to confront the possibility that the boundaries are not as firm as we thought. The Mothman did not ask to become a symbol. It was simply there, and then it was gone. And we have been trying to understand what it meant ever since. The Mothman, in the end, is a story about watching and being watched. It appeared in Point Pleasant at a moment when the town was already on edge, already living in the shadow of industrial decline and infrastructural decay. The TNT area, with its poisoned ground and crumbling bunkers, was a monument to what had been built and then abandoned. The Silver Bridge, with its corroded eye-bars and deferred maintenance, was another. The Mothman did not cause these problems, it simply marked them, made them visible, gave them a face, or at least a pair of glowing eyes. In the decades since the sightings ended, the Mothman has come to represent something larger than itself. It has become a symbol for the consequences of neglect, for the disasters that occur when we fail to pay attention to the systems we depend on. The bridge fell not because of a monster, but because of corrosion, because inspections were inadequate, because someone decided that fixing the eye-bar could wait. The Mothman appeared at a place marked by contamination, by chemicals leaching into the soil and water, by the toxic residue of wartime industry. It appeared at a time when the people of Point Pleasant were living with the slow realization that their town was in decline, that the jobs were leaving, that the future was uncertain. The creature, in this reading, is a metaphor for the things we choose not to see. It is the warning sign we ignore. The structural crack we tell ourselves is not that bad. The slow accumulation of small failures. That it stood on the roadside. It perched on rooftops. It looked them in the eye. And when they finally understood, when the bridge fell and the full weight of the disaster became clear, it left. Its work was done. The warning had been delivered. The lesson. It is not a story about vigilance or preparedness, or the importance of infrastructure maintenance, though it could be read that way. It is a story about the limits of foresight, about the fact that we cannot always prevent disaster even when we see it coming. The Mothman appeared for 13 months. Dozens of people saw it. Some of them were terrified. Some of them told the police, the press, anyone who would listen, and the bridge still fell. 46 people still died. The warning, such as it was, did not save them. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the Mothman legend. Omens do not prevent disaster. They announce it. They bear witness. The Mothman did not sabotage the bridge, but neither did it stop the collapse. It was present. It was watching, and it was powerless, or unwilling, to change the outcome. And that raises a question about the function of omens in general. If they cannot prevent tragedy, what good are they? Why does the universe, or fate, or whatever force we imagine, controls these things, bother to send a warning if the warning cannot be heeded? One answer is that omens are not for the benefit of those who are about to die. They are for the survivors, for the witnesses, for those who will live to tell the story. The Mothman appeared to the people of Point Pleasant not to save them from the bridge collapse, but to mark the event as significant, as something more than random chance. It transformed the disaster from an engineering failure into a cosmic event, a moment when the veil between the people who saw the Mothman before the collapse and who survived the collapse carry a knowledge that others do not. They know that the world is stranger than it appears, that there are forces at work that we do not understand, and that disaster can announce itself in forms we are not equipped to interpret. This knowledge is not power. It does not make the survivors safer or wiser or more capable of preventing the next disaster. But it does make them different. They have seen something that most people will never see. They have been marked by the experience, made witnesses in the deepest sense of the word. And the story they tell, the story of the Mothman and the bridge and the 46 dead, is a story about the fragility of the world we have built and the shadows that gather at its edges. The Mothman, as a modern legend, also speaks to our contemporary anxieties about surveillance and visibility. The creature is defined, above all, by its eyes, large, red, unblinking, watching. In an age of cameras and satellites and algorithms that track our every movement, the image of a creature that watches without acting, that sees without intervening, resonates in ways that would have been impossible in 1966. We live, increasingly, in a world where we are always being watched by governments, by corporations, by systems of data collection, so vast and complex that no single human could comprehend them. We have created our own Mothman, watchers in the dark presences that know more about us than we know about them, entities that observe and record, but do not explain themselves. The Mothman, in this context, is a folk warning about the dangers of being seen. It is the nightmare version of surveillance, the panopticon with wings. It fills those who see it with dread, with a sense that they have been marked, that they are known in a way that violates the boundaries of privacy and selfhood. And when disaster comes, the watchers, the Mothmen, literal or metaphorical, are gone, leaving behind only data, only records, only the knowledge that someone or something knew what was coming and did not stop. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, is a small town on the Ohio River. It has survived the collapse of the Silver Bridge, the decline of its industrial base, and the strange fame that the Mothman brought. It has rebuilt, adapted, and found a way to live with the legend. The annual Mothman Festival is a celebration, but it is also an acknowledgement, a way of saying that the past cannot be undone, that the dead cannot be brought back, but that the story can be told, and in the telling, something is preserved. The Mothman itself, whatever it was, has not returned. There have been occasional reports over the years. A sighting in 1999, another in 2015, but none with the frequency or intensity of the original 1966 to 1967 wave. The creature, or the phenomenon, or the collective hallucination, or the misidentified crane, has moved on. It left Point Pleasant as suddenly as it arrived, and it has not come back. The town is no longer on the edge of catastrophe. The new bridge is safe. The TNT area is slowly being reclaimed by nature, its bunkers collapsing into the earth, its contamination gradually leaching away. The threshold has closed, but the memory remains. The witnesses remember, the survivors remember, and the story is told over and over in books and films and festivals and late-night conversations. The Mothman is no longer a presence in Point Pleasant. It is a story, and stories, unlike omens, can be carried forward. They can be passed down, adapted, reinterpreted. They can survive long after the events that inspired them have faded into history. The Mothman, then, is not just a creature or a legend or a metaphor. It is a question that the people of Point Pleasant asked themselves in the winter of 1966 as they drove past the TNT area in the dark and wondered what was watching them from the shadows. It is a question that the survivors asked themselves on the 15th of December, 1967, as they pulled bodies from the Ohio River and tried to understand why the bridge had fallen. It is a question that we are still asking, more than 50 years later, as we look at the crumbling infrastructure of our own towns and cities and wonder what warnings we might be missing, what signs we are choosing not to see. The Mothman does not answer that question. It only asks it over and over, with its red eyes and its silent wings. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the function of the omen is not to prevent disaster but to mark it, to say, this matters. This is significant. This is a moment when the world changed and you were there to see it. The Mothman appeared, and the bridge fell, and the people remembered. The warning was delivered. The pattern was made visible, and we are left to decide, each in our own way, what it means. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore, myths, and mysterious creatures. See you next time.